After my recent experience as a first data hire at a startup didn't turn out how I'd hoped, I realized I overlooked something really important, checking whether their stated ambitions actually matched reality and my own values. So I took time to reflect on what I wish I had known before jumping in. And from those reflections, I put together a list of key things to consider when saying yes to a job offer. Pretty quickly, I saw that wasn't only about my situation, those points apply quite broadly, whether you're a data analyst, data scientist, ML engineer, junior, senior, or somewhere in between. These are all things that are worth thinking about before saying yes to the job offer. You might need to adjust them slightly to your own situation, but they'll help you avoid making the same mistakes I did. So here are the list of 15 things you should definitely know about the company and the role you're applying to before accepting an offer for a data science or data analytics role in tech. First of all, do they have data? And what kind of data do they have? This is the first and probably most crucial thing to check in whether the company actually has data and what kind of data they have. The interview process can give some hints, especially if you're given a coding task or a take-home assignment. Pay close attention to the datasets that they share, and those often reflect what's available internally and what are the people internally using for their day-to-day tasks. But don't rely 100% on that. When you talk with the people at the company, dig a little deeper, ask directly how long have they been collecting data. Is it transactional data, meaning logins, payments, account activity, or is it event-based behavioral data that tracks user actions inside their product? For most analytical roles, having clear insights into user behavior is crucial, so you'll want to confirm that this data exists. Also, don't forget considering granularity. Is the data user level or session level, or is it aggregated on some more superficial level? Do they track a broad range of events or just a few core actions? How far back does the data go, and what is their data retention policy? All these factors directly shape the insights that you'll be able to generate working there. Bottom line, knowing upfront what kind of data the company has and if it fits the work you want to do and that they want you to do is essential before accepting the job. Point number 2, how is the data structured and who's responsible for it? After making sure that the company has data for you to work with, you need to understand how the data is structured and what is the infrastructure behind it. How does it look like? This one is critical, especially if you're applying for data analytics, data science, or any ML roles. Because if the data is messy, disconnected, or hard to access, that inevitably will become your problem, whether you signed up for it or not. You can start by asking straightforward questions. How is the data stored and processed? What tools do they use for storage, for ETLs, for analysis? Are they running clean, modern pipelines, or is everything patched together in Postgres and Excel? Most importantly, ask if there's a dedicated data engineering team. Or is data handled entirely by developers, meaning that they're logging events, managing transactional data, and backing things up? This detail alone can drastically alter your day-to-day experience. Without dedicated support, you might spend most of your time aligning mismatched numbers across different systems, like trying to reconcile financial records with transactional logs or syncing event-based payments with actual revenue. And that is extremely frustrating, especially if you didn't sign up for this kind of task or your role does not entail those areas. Some questions that might help bring clarity to that are, do they have trusted data sets? Do they exist and who built them? Are there any dashboards that are built on reliable data? Will you need to build things from scratch? Will you be responsible for creating your own ETLs or dealing with CI/CD pipelines? How much of their data is reliable and how much of it is actually quality assured? If your role is mainly analytical, so data scientist, data analyst, product analyst, or ML engineer, not knowing this upfront could seriously undermine your success. And even if your role is more engineering focused, so like data engineer, you'll want to have clarity about the scope so you're not blindsided by how much foundational work awaits you. Bottom line here is that if there is no clear infrastructure, no data engineers, no trusted data sets or data sources, this is not really a data science or analytics role. It's a solo, rebuild the entire stack kind of role. And that's something you really deserve to know before you accept the job. Third point is, what tools and tech do they use, and are you set up to work with them? Once you understand the data and the infrastructure and who's responsible for handling that infrastructure, the next thing to check is their tools and tech stack. This directly shapes how fast and effective you'll be in your role. Try to ask clearly, what tools are they using for querying, visualization, scheduling, and storage of data and data pipelines? Do these match what you already know, or at least align with what you're interested to learn about? Of course, they probably already filtered you based on the skills that you presented in your resume, but still, some companies still steer clear of cloud solutions altogether, while others are tightly bound to a specific cloud provider like AWS or Azure or GCP, and you'll have to fit in that system. On the BI front, they may be using Tableau, Power BI, Looker, Metabase, or something else entirely. Sometimes you won't know the true stack that they're working with until you ask, even though they might have listed a lot of things on the job description. That does not necessarily mean that they have them available for you to work with. Not having prior experience with their exact tech stack isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but it's critical to know whether you'll get time and support to learn. So even if you don't have experience with the tools that they're using, ask if you're expected to jump straight into completely unfamiliar tools, or is there a room or time for you to set up and ramp up. Another key detail here is understanding tool restrictions. In companies with some strict security policies, you might find yourself unable to install external services or even use common open source solutions, which can, of course, seriously limit your productivity or the workflows that you're typically used to do. Finally, ask whether they usually buy tools off the shelf or whether they build everything internally. If most tools are custom built, expect your work to involve navigating complex internal processes or relying on a few specialized engineers or teams, making even some straightforward tasks harder than they should be. Ultimately, the tools they use will shape your independence, effectiveness, and your day-to-day experience. So make sure you're clear about what you're getting into and whether it fits how you'd like to work. Now that we've considered the most critical part of the roles involving data, the data itself, and the tools that you can use to access it, let's talk about the role specifically. So point number 4 is, does the role title actually match what you want and also know how to do? The job title and the job description won't always reflect what you'll be really doing day to day. Just because a role is called data scientist or ML engineer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be building models, applying statistics, or diving into cutting-edge research. You might spend most of your time setting up basic A/B tests or repeatedly explaining p-values and statistical significance in different product meetings. Conversely, if you are a data analyst who genuinely enjoys stakeholder interactions, building dashboards, giving strategic insights, the last thing you want is a role that traps you knee-deep in building airflow pipelines or debugging broken ETLs. So that's why those earlier points about data infrastructure and tools are very crucial and critical for you to learn. They give context to what is actually possible and expected in the role. So once you clearly see what's behind the scenes, you can better understand what the job truly entails, not just what is listed on the job description. And try to be honest with yourself. Ask yourself, what kind of work do you actually enjoy doing every day? Then confirm that this is what the role you applied to genuinely involves. Otherwise, no matter how impressive the title seems or sounds on paper, your daily reality might end up wearing you down and actually not work towards your career progression overall. After learning about your specific role, try to learn more about the team that you will be working with or working in. So that's point number 5, who's on your team and where do you fit within the team? So after understanding the role itself, the next critical step is to look around the team and learn about who you'll be working with, who you will be joining, especially those who will be working closest to you. So try to start by finding out, is there already an analytics team in place? How is the work divided? What skill sets do they already have? And what gaps are they hoping that you'll fill in? It's crucial to know if you're joining a team of experienced seniors or a group of junior data analysts who might need your guidance, and considering whether you're stepping into a collaborative environment or will you be the only data-focused person. This significantly impacts the expectations you'll face and the support that you'll receive while working. So in larger companies, roles usually are more specialized. Maybe there are analytical engineers, data visualization specialists, dedicated business analysts. That usually means clearer boundaries, mentorship opportunities, and less overlap of different tasks that you'll be doing. But in smaller companies, you might need to wear many hats, which isn't necessarily bad, of course, but it's something that you'll want to know up front. This is also your chance to clarify and understand your onboarding details, so how you will be spending your first weeks or months in the role. Try to learn whether someone will help you, mentor you, whether you'll have a buddy that will kind of onboard you into the role. Is there documentation available, or will you have to figure out a lot of stuff on your own? Finally, knowing the team structure ahead of time helps you position yourself better in the interview process. So if you understand exactly what they're looking for, technically or strategically, you can highlight your strength as precisely the solution that they might need. That will be the perfect piece of puzzle for their team. So take the time to learn about your potential teammates, their roles, experience, and skills. It gives you a clearer sense of your future day-to-day and sets you up for success right from the start. Point number 6 is, what does your hiring manager thinks the ideal candidate looks like? So once you've figured out the team setup, it's crucial to understand what your hiring manager actually imagines as the perfect fit for the role. Job descriptions might list tons of responsibilities and every buzzword imaginable, but what do they genuinely value day to day? That's another question. So consider asking or probing with questions like, out of all these listed skills, what matter the most in practice for this specific role? Or what differentiates someone who thrives in this role from someone who just gets by? Or how will the success for this specific role that you'll be hired for be measured in the first maybe 3 or 6 months or up to a year? Getting clarity on these points shows you what's really expected, and more importantly, it reveals whether the role genuinely aligns with your interests. Maybe you're strong in certain areas but less excited about the others. You'll want to know upfront if they're seeking someone deeply involved with, stakeholder management, or heavily focused on modeling, or mainly responsible for building and cleaning up data pipelines. It also gives you an insight into how you'll be evaluated, so how you might be able to grow professionally, and whether the role truly values your strengths or just needs someone to fill in the gaps within the team or the projects that they're working on. This kind of nuance rarely appears in a job, but 1 or 2 honest conversations during the interview process can kind of help you paint a clearer, more realistic picture of what you will be doing day to day. Point number 7 is knowing, what does career growth look like in this company and in this specific role. So once you've clarified what's expected in the role, the next important question is, what happens next? What's the growth path, and how does career progression actually work at this company? Some places, usually bigger companies, have a clear structure, maybe defined levels like senior, lead, principal, staff, or whatever, with regular performance reviews and promotion cycles. Other companies, particularly startups or smaller companies, might tell you that titles aren't important. And that can sound, appealing at first, maybe, but often it means that there's no real plan for your growth. And learning about that is also very important to understand how long you can stay in this company. Some questions that you might probe with during the interview process are questions around how does promotion work here? Are there regular performance reviews and performance cycles? What's the timeline for people changing their roles and their levels? And is there flexibility to grow into other roles or explore different business areas? That's, of course, a very challenging question for the interview process because they do want you to fit this specific role that they're hiring for, but still asking some questions for maybe different peers that you get to interview with will help you understand whether there's actually career progression opportunities or not. At the same time, if you're asking a talent manager or recruiter those questions, be cautious with vague promises like there are plenty of opportunities for growth or you can easily move across teams. Companies naturally want to sell the role, but what's said during hiring process actually doesn't necessarily always match reality. So pay attention to your manager's perspective on growth too. Are they looking for someone to grow into a bigger position or just someone who will be reliable and stays put in this specific position for a long time? Especially in smaller teams, managers might avoid hiring more senior people, sometimes maybe due to lack of scope or because they feel threatened by someone too ambitious. And on the other hand, it can be a very good green flag if the manager is hiring you for maybe a smaller role for the onboarding part, but then they already have a great plan for your different opportunities that you might encounter while working there. All these details shape your long-term satisfaction, whether you feel supported and challenged or stuck and frustrated. And don't shy away from asking these questions because ultimately you'll want a role that fits into your broader career goals. Speaking of the hiring manager is point number 8. Learn who is your hiring manager and try to assess if you can actually work with them. Your manager can truly make or break your experience at a company. They can be the reason you thrive, you grow, you feel energized, or the reason you feel stuck, drained, or regret the job entirely after a few months. So it's crucial to get a good sense of them during the interview process as much as it's possible, of course. Try to understand their management style clearly. Ask them questions about whether they're a hands-on, hands-off manager. Do they provide guidance or do they expect you to navigate everything yourself? What's their background? Are they from product or engineering or analytics? Would they be able to genuinely understand your role enough to support you and advocate for you? And try to watch out for red flags too. For example, I've personally experienced managers at smaller companies who were very eager to move fast hiring, fast decision making, fast executing of any projects, but not necessarily with thinking through things carefully. They hadn't considered if hiring me even made sense in the long run, and it eventually backfired. So after you've had interactions with your potential manager, try to ask yourself, does this person seem emotionally stable and self-aware? Do they speak respectfully about their current team? Would you just genuinely feel comfortable approaching them if something is off or talking to them about a project that's not necessarily going very well? Since you'll spend a significant amount of time reporting directly to them, you need to trust that they'll have your back and actually know what they're doing. A great manager can become your biggest reason to stay, or, a bad one might be why you leave much sooner than you've expected. Moving on from the manager is actually a question of priorities and projects that you'll be working on. So try to understand who owns your backlog and how your backlog will be handled and prioritized. In other words, who decides what you work on, where do tasks originate, and how they're assigned to people or chosen by people to work on. This can, of course, vary greatly by company. In some places, especially bigger companies, you might sit with a centralized analytics team where requests flow in from across the business, and you'll pick tasks from a shared queue or a shared pool, or maybe based off on what skill set this requires. Elsewhere, you might be embedded in a product team, working directly with a product manager who prioritizes your tasks sprint by sprint. Sometimes it's your manager who owns the backlog. Sometimes actually it's the stakeholders who control it. And sometimes that's kind of entirely up to you too, which can mean great autonomy, but also a lot of stress if there is no clear direction. And In many cases, that's a question of preference. So try to ask questions during the interview process about how are the projects scoped and prioritized. Will you be expected to, triage and push back on incoming requests? Is there a sprint-based workflow? Is it more free-form? Is there a clear planning rhythm, like weekly, monthly, quarterly, etc.? It helps to understand how the goals for the whole company are actually created. So the OKRs, the objective key results, are they brought from the leadership down, or are they largely driven by the teams? That also will help you to understand how your backlog will be populated by different types of tasks. I know sometimes it's hard to ask those questions during the interview process, but it might be helpful to understand how flexible the approach is. So, can you protect blocks of time for deep work? Will you constantly need to respond to ad hoc requests? Is there an expectation? How frequently and how fast do you respond to those requests? And this connects back to a manager too. So if they don't help shield you from the chaos or assist with prioritization, that's likely to cause burnout, especially if you're not very senior or aren't that interested in this part of the role. So make sure you get a clear picture of how tasks flow, who decides priorities, and how much control you'll actually have over your own time. Point number 10 is, who are your stakeholders and what's it like working with them? Your stakeholders, I hate this name honestly, but whatever. People who you will work with, people who will rely on your insights to make decisions, set strategy, or build products, they'll request your work, provide feedback, and shape how your contributions are valued. So it's crucial to understand who they are and how their work is structured. In mid-sized or larger tech companies, stakeholders are typically product managers and engineers, designers, so everyone who works within the product team. You'll support product decisions, help them define metrics, run A/B tests, do analysis, analyze feature launches, etc. Being embedded closely in the product development cycle usually means that there is very tight collaboration and frequent feedback loops with the product development teams. But in smaller or less mature companies, stakeholders might be pretty much anyone within the company, from sales, marketing teams to the CEO, CFO, CTO, whatnot. So here priorities can shift very quickly, requests may lack structure, and expectations can vary wildly. And to manage that, try to understand who will typically request your work in this company, who influences the priorities, who reviews or critiques what type of work you did and the output that you provided. Do stakeholders already work closely with the data, or do they understand data's limits? Do they expect magical answers that happen at the snap of the finger, or do they understand that it takes actually a lot of time to clear the data sets that you'll be working with and provide them that one number that seems so easy to calculate? It also is very helpful to gauge their technical proficiency. So do they ask thoughtful questions, or do they just request things without a lot of context? Are they genuinely curious and open to data and insights, or are they simply looking to validate decisions that they've already made? That is a pretty important part. Another important factor is who will advocate for you when you're not in the room. So stakeholders significantly influence how your performance is perceived, especially if they're senior or very vocal. So if possible, try to speak with some of those people during the interview process. Ask them about their experiences working with the data teams. Their answers can help you reveal a lot about your future day-to-day work and how satisfying or challenging the role will be. Point number 11 is, what is the real company culture, and do their values actually align with yours? Company culture matters now more than ever, especially with swiftly changing priorities and company cultures in tech across all the world. But it's also tougher than ever to assess, especially now that the job market feels shaky and layoffs are very common. Still, it's critical to think about because culture directly affects your day-to-day experience, your stress levels, the overall happiness in your role, your career progression, pretty much everything about how you'll feel working for that company. Try to understand what the company genuinely values? Do they encourage balance, or do they reward burnout? Do they reward long working hours and overtime? Is there an unspoken expectation that you're always online, replying after hours and paid, or do they respect your boundaries? These questions, of course, are very tricky and can feel super uncomfortable to ask, especially when you're interviewing, of course, if you don't want to seem too demanding or too difficult. And honestly, if you're confident enough to ask them directly, that's amazing. Hold on to that. But if you're not, there are some subtler ways to uncover the truth. For example, when you're talking either to your hiring manager or to the stakeholders or to the peers during the interview process, ask them how they handle tight deadlines or sudden project requests. Have they been in a situation where there was an incident and they had to manage it, or different outages? Who gets called? When do they get called? And how is the situation managed in the long term? Also try to ask, what do they do to protect teams from, I wouldn't necessarily mention the word burnout, but something around like, how does the team manages resources when there's too many requests from various different stakeholders. Another point when it comes to company culture is career progression. And when discussing career progression, try to notice who actually progresses, not necessarily during the interview process, but you can look up people in the leadership teams on LinkedIn. Do you see diversity there, or do most senior leaders look very similar and have very similar background? That will help you to understand how tough your life might be in the company if you don't fit that picture. It is very frequent and not necessarily on purpose. A company that advertises externally diversity, inclusion, and all of those great practices doesn't necessarily match that in the reality. But ignoring that for you will cost you in stress, frustration, and a lot of wasted time. Point number 12 is your compensation and benefits. So what's your total compensation, and do the benefits that they provide actually matter to you? This is probably the easiest thing to ask about because companies usually expect that. That's one of the first things that you've discussed, your pay. But there is actually much more to compensation than just your base salary. Start by getting clear on the basics. What is the monthly base salary? Are there any conditions that might affect it? Is the amount guaranteed, or could it vary based on your performance or the company's performance? Then try to dig into the additional layers. So some companies provide bonuses. Check in with the recruiter during the hiring process that if there is a company-wide or performance-based bonus, and what are the conditions for that bonus. Maybe they have revenue targets that guide whether you will receive a bonus or not. And that's really tricky to assess whether that will go into your total compensation in the end or not, because company goals are set very extensively. So they're overextended typically. A company might think that they will grow 10 or 20% in revenue year over year. And even if that's not realistic, this number might alone affect whether you get the bonus or not. More common and more reliable option for additional pay is stock options or equity. Some companies offer different performance-based or just tenure-based stock option plans. Make sure that you understand how they're structured, and realistically, do they hold any meaningful value? How much will you get at any point? Know your vesting period, all of that stuff. Don't stop at financial compensation though. Benefits that companies provide matter just as much, and they're often much harder to probe into comfortably. But they're really important to know. Things like how many vacation days do they give? Is there additional time off for mental health or well-being? What's the policy around sick leave, parental leave, or extended medical leave? Bad things happen, and it's really good to be prepared. And it does get tricky at those points, depending on who you are and how you feel in this process. Asking about things like parental leave can feel risky, like you're, signaling that you might use them up soon. Legally, employers, of course, cannot discriminate, but realistically, Nobody stops them from just not hiring you if you ask a question about parental leave for any other reason or no reason at all. It is unfair and frustrating, but it's also the truth. One way to go around that is to ask a generalized question. Ask for a document or PDF or deck that they have that will outline the full compensation and benefits package. Usually larger companies provide this readily. They already have it. They don't want to just list all things to you. They just want to send you one PDF and then they're done. But if that's harder to get for that company, try to find reviews on Glassdoor where people discuss what are their compensation and benefits and do they actually get them. Don't overlook the fine print as well. Make sure that you know whether there's a probation period, how long is this probation. Make sure that you know if there's a notice period, both during and after probation. Make sure you know how severance is handled, or do you have a garden leave clause? So something like you can't go work for a competitor at least 3 or 6 months after you quit this company. Point number 13 is, I think, a quite rare one, but still pretty important to make sure that you will get actually the tools and the equipment that you need to do your job. This one is kind of obvious, but it's surprisingly easy to overlook. Will the company actually provide the equipment and tools you need? So like laptop, computer, desktop, phone, what are the other peripherals or devices you may need depending on the type of work that you'll be doing. Start with the essentials. Do they provide a company laptop? Is it Mac or PC, or does it match what you're used to be working with? Will they give you monitors, proper mouse, keyboard, headphones, whether you will be working in the office or if you will be working remotely? Will they offer home office support like standing desks, ergonomic chairs, or budget for improving your workspace? A question about ergonomic chairs, surprisingly, is very important for the office too, because you would be surprised how bad are chairs in some of the offices of seemingly very, very rich big companies. If your role involves heavy computation, like training ML models or working with large data sets, find out where that processing power comes from. Do they offer like cloud-based infrastructure, GPU access, or are you expected to manage things locally? And then what kind of computer will they get you to do that? And there's other things sometimes that are missed is, will you have to use your personal devices for work? More often than not, this is actually a situation in some of the companies that I've been joining that I've been required to install security or authentication apps like two-factor authentication on my personal phone to be able to access the service of that company and my accounts within the company. It may seem minor, but for me personally, it kind of crosses a line and signals that company doesn't necessarily view boundaries between work and personal life very strictly. Lastly, some companies are flexible about letting you request specific tools, while others have very strict procurement or IT rules. It is worth asking upfront how open they are to approving new software or specialized equipment, especially if you rely on some very particular workflows. Point number 14, and that one is the most important one. How financially stable is the company, and is there a realistic risk of layoffs? And they might not necessarily be always related. With so many tech companies downsizing, though, it's essential that you do your homework before signing anything and agreeing to anything or choosing between different roles. Start by checking public layoff trackers like layoffs.fyi to see if the company recently made cuts and how significant they were. In the US, layoffs often require advanced legal disclosures, so a quick check might turn up helpful details. You can also scan LinkedIn or Glassdoor for hints. People frequently leave subtle or not so subtle clues in their exit posts or reviews. Then try to dig deeper into the company's funding and its business model. If it's a VC-funded startup, check how much run they realistically have left, how much money they've been given, how much they've been growing, what are their targets. If they recently raised money or if they are tightening budgets to stretch current funds, if the company is profitable or are they still burning through cash. Also, make sure that you understand their product and if it has a sustainable, stable market, or is it just a short-term trend. For smaller or early stage startups, consider carefully whether the product solves a genuine and ongoing problem for a sizable market. You probably don't want to join a flashy but narrow niche that lacks a substantial user base. If you're looking at a larger company, shift your focus specifically to the team that you will be joining. So, over the past few years, team focused on internal tools, research and development, or experimental products or projects have been often the first ones cut during budget tightening. Meanwhile, teams that are working on revenue driving, like, I don't know, ads at Meta or in-app purchases at King or core growth and product analytics, they tend to be safer bets since leaders rarely mess with the teams directly tied to profitability. So when you're doing your research about the company and the team, make sure that you understand whether this team contributes directly to revenue or if it's experimental or infrastructure heavy. Make sure that you know if they've experienced layoffs before and how they were handled, what kind of roles did they cut, and understand how critical is your team's role in the company's overall success. Ultimately, it's not about how exciting the company seems, it's about whether it still will be stable and your role will be secure in a year from now. So, yeah, make sure to do your due diligence and protect yourself. Point number 15 is something that I overlook too much. I tend to make very rational and analytical driven decisions, and I don't always listen to my gut, but this point is also very important. What does your gut say about this whole interview process? This is very tricky, and I'll be honest, I haven't listened closely to my gut, but I've known people who do, and it saved them from tough situations. If something feels off, try not to dismiss it. Maybe your interviewers seem totally drained or disinterested or emotionally checked out. Try to pay attention to that. Or maybe if your potential manager seems rushed, cold, or dismissive, like they're doing you a favor by even talking to you, take note of that too. And especially if anyone casually mentions something unethical or brushes off some uncomfortable topics, that's a clear sign that you shouldn't ignore. And it doesn't always have to be one big, clear red flag. Sometimes it's just a vague feeling, an odd power dynamic, a subtle lack of enthusiasm from people that you're meeting, or a discomfort that you're getting during the interview process that you can't quite pinpoint. Your intuition might be noticing something your rational mind hasn't fully processed yet. Does that mean that you absolutely should not take a job if your gut feels off? I mean, not necessarily. Everyone's circumstances are different, and sometimes practical realities like rent or bills or healthcare take priority. So, of course, I'd never judge someone for choosing stability over uncertainty, but at least try to acknowledge what your gut is trying to tell you. So, if things don't work out, you're not completely blindsided. In the end, the point of this whole list of things that it's important to fully prepare yourself for what you're stepping into when you're accepting a new role. Especially now when the market is changing very rapidly and companies shifting priorities, changing their recruitment policies overnight. But going in with your eyes open can make a huge difference. So take whatever resonates with you from this checklist, adapt it to your role, your situation, your goals, and even if just one of those points helps you make a slightly better decision, I'll genuinely be happy. I wish I would have listened to someone telling me those points a year ago, but alas, apparently I gotta learn on my own mistakes. So now I have this list for you. And if you've got your own red flag stories or lessons that you've learned accepting a role that you didn't like in the end, please share them below. Let's keep helping each other out. And thanks for watching and have a nice day.